Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. The self-managed super fund sector in Australia has hit a new record with more than 625,000 self-managed super funds now registered. There's been a strong rebound since COVID, with Gen X leading the way in the SMSF world. These are some of the findings from the annual benchmark report from Class, an Australian accounting technology company with a focus on SMSFs. As always, this is general information only, and you should seek professional advice before making investment decisions. You should talk to someone also if you want to get into an SMSF fund yourself. Tim Steele is the CEO of Class. Tim, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Sean, thank you for having me. Lovely to be back.
So the sector's growing. What's behind that?
I think it's reflective of people's continued interest in taking control of their super and wanting to at least take a more active role in supporting their long-term retirement outcomes. And SMSFs continue to be a really attractive vehicle for doing that. We know technology has played a role, so there are opportunity for people to perhaps access an SMSF fund, establish it and or manage it, perhaps more cost-effectively. And so we think that's driving the overall growth.
We haven't actually done much on DIY funds for quite a while. So just really quickly, Tim, give us the pros and cons of an SMSF and the sort of people, and I appreciate that your role in life, you'd have many, many pros and very few cons, but no, just give us both sides of the coin and the people who are most suited to it.
I can rely on our data, Sean. I think you can tell us who's actually establishing funds. So that's interesting. And you said in your introductory remarks that it's been driven by Gen X. That is true based on our data, and that and millennials. We've got just over 80% of establishments for that sector. And the average balance on establishment this year, for the first time based on our data, exceeded 500,000 at 537,000 for establishment. So when we think about who is establishing it, it's typically the Gen X, but also millennials at almost 28%, and they're establishing it with over $500,000 of superannuation assets when they join, which I think gives you a sense of the point at which perhaps either they take much greater interest in their super and therefore an SMSF might make more sense, or they reach a stage where they've got a certain scale that actually the economics of an SMSF may make more sense as well. So the pros and cons, it depends. For us, really, we don't want just everyone piling into SMSFs. It's like everything. We encourage people to get advice. We're big believers in the benefits of financial advice. And so ultimately, financial advisors, we're making recommendations to their clients where they think it makes sense. And it's not just driven by the amount of money you've got in your superannuation fund. I think it's determined by your own personal preferences, the type of assets you want to hold, the role that you want to have in contributing to helping shape your super. But it is a very flexible solution that can grow with you over time as perhaps your needs become more complex. And it does give you the control that I think many Australians seek. Certainly, it can be, at different stages of life, it can be a little bit more complicated for people where you're actually, if you are doing it yourselves, and so there may come a point in time where you'd prefer to delegate or have actually an APRA-regulated fund take care of that for you. But we are seeing people hold SMSFs longer, and certainly when we look at our non-concessional contributions, we've seen that at a much older age group as well.
I had an SMSF for a while. My work kind of convinced me to not do it anymore because I talk about all sorts of companies and bonds and things like that, and I actually prefer to be at arm's length. But the one thing about it which I learnt from the experience was the need to be continually across it. It's not a set and forget product, is it?
No, it's not. And quite frankly, we don't think superannuation should be for anyone, given the importance of what it might mean for their long-term retirement outcomes. But you are right that I think typically people who choose to have an SMSF do want to be more engaged in the process. And we see that in some of our data. And when we think about things like the pension establishment, we look at our data and 93% of members on Class who are over the age of 65 have actually established a pension. And that compares, I think, very favourably to APRA-regulated funds where it's just under 50% at 49%. And so it's clear to us from that one data point that certainly SMSF trustees are typically far more engaged with their superannuation, which we do think is a good thing, irrespective of whether it's an APRA fund or an SMSF.
Stay with me, Tim. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Class CEO, Tim Steele. So the annual benchmark report, one of the things that came out was changes to tax liabilities and how that's affecting members. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I should be really clear, Sean, that this is proposed legislation. So it's quite controversial legislation that's yet to actually pass the Senate. We think it's going back in October, but it's Division 296. And effectively, there's a cap at over $3 million at which you will pay a greater tax on assets above that amount. And so we've done some analysis for the first time looking at what that impact might be to class members. And it probably surprised us on the significance of the potential tax liability. On average, for the affected members, and there were 16,000 or just over 16,500 members on class data that would be affected at an average tax liability of just under $50,000. So it was $49,925. The challenge then again became, well, how many of those are going to be able to afford to pay that tax without having to sell assets? And we found that there were 5% who are going to struggle to pay that tax bill.
Well, it's still a lot of people who have that much in superannuation, though.
It is a lot of people who have that much money. And I think, and that's probably why, from a political perspective, it seemed to be sort of fair game, if you like. Yeah. I don't think anyone's going to be crying poor for those people who've got over $3 million in their super. Our view, and I have to say, is that it is a really interesting potential legislation that I think for the first time is proposing to tax unrealised gains, which I think creates a really interesting and potentially problematic precedent for tax law in Australia. And it means that people may not have had the benefit of obviously realising that asset, and therefore may not have the cash reserves available to actually pay the tax that's liable.
Okay, what about asset allocation? What are you seeing there? We hear lots about ETFs, and we speak to people talking about exchange traded funds. Are self-managed super fund participants participating in that whole ETF popularism at the moment?
Yeah, not surprising. I think for the reasons that you'd be familiar with, Sean, that these are transparent, low cost, diversified elements of ETFs that make them really attractive to the right clients, at least for a proportion of your portfolio. And so our data shows that now just under 33% of all SMSFs on class actually hold SMSFs, and they are in aggregate about 5.4% of the total assets on class. And we have circa $325 billion that's administered on class. And so it's a reasonable chunk of change that is flowing into ETFs.
Yeah. Okay, another thing in the report, it talks about members not receiving advice. We at Fear and Greed are great believers in advice, but if you've got $500,000, you've got to be pretty good not to receive advice, I suspect.
Oh, look, we're also big believers in advice, Sean. And that number does concern us. I mean, it's not surprising. For our data, just under 50,000 members received advice the last 3 years. So that number's been fairly stagnant. As the number of SMSFs have grown, as a percentage, therefore, the number of people receiving advice has gone down. And we track that data by looking at the number of funds that actually have an advice fee deducted from their account. Look, we still believe there's an opportunity for more Australians to get advice, and we're hopeful that the Quality of Advice Review Tranche 2, as that's released, will at least create the capacity for more Australians to get advice cost effectively, irrespective of whether you have an SMSF or an APRA fund.
So how do we get people more enthusiastic about getting advice?
Oh, I think this is part of really what's driving some of the regulatory reform that's been proposed. And I touched on Quality of Advice Review, which is all about the accessibility and affordability of advice, removing red tape and some of the complexities that make advice more expensive for advisors to comply with the legislation. And I think the fact that we're going to have a different tier of advisor, if Tranche 2 is passed, then that will at least enable people through their super fund to be able to get access to advice. I mean, we'd love to see, quite openly, with obvious commercial bias declared, Sean, we'd love to see the accountant's exemption for SMSF advice return. We think that would be a real benefit to ultimately SMSFs and more Australians getting access to advice. But I really think that the QAR reforms are an important step towards seeking to achieve that. And then it's helping continue to reinforce the value of advice. I think people have got to take a proactive step to want to do something about their situation, and either reaching out to their super fund or their accountant or their advisor can be an important step towards getting the right advice.
Do you think the self-managed super fund sector will continue to grow? And this, of course, is related to the advice question, because if there are more people doing it themselves, I hope there's more demand for advisors.
Yeah, we hope so too, Sean. I mean, I think I don't think it's necessarily perfectly characterisation of saying, hey, SMSFs equals DIY. SMSF is obviously a tax structure by which you hold your superannuation assets. And it gets, based on our data, 27% of those people are actually getting advice today. There may have been a greater percentage who got advice earlier. We do believe the SMSF sector will continue to grow because we think it's a really attractive, flexible structure that supports people as their needs become more complex. And so for that reason, we believe SMSFs will continue to be attractive, and we hope people are getting advice where it's appropriate for them to do so.
Tim, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you for having me, Sean.
That was Tim Steele, CEO of Class. This is the Fear and Greed business interview. Remember, this is general information only, and you should seek professional advice, as we've just been discussing, before making investment decisions. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.